On October 13th, 1965, I was 12, and this was we all went to school, and our dad really didn't want us to go down there for this fishing. There was a lot of women and children there, and so we're all just goofing around, and Mom says, all of a sudden, she said, "Look," and we turned around, and these game agents are coming out of the bushes behind. And these guys are big guys. And we see them in their jet boats, putting them in the water, and they're running with these jet boats and putting them in the water. And they ram that canoe. Now, my little brother can't swim. And but luckily where they were at, when they rammed that canoe, he could walk, back. And then that attack was just on. They grabbed my cousin and was pounding her head into the, and we're young. She must have been about 14, and they're just slamming people around. They have Dorian in the bushes and Don George, and they got their shirts off and they're hitting them with these blackjacks, I think they call them. And they're grabbing my dad and my mom and it just went chaos. And my grandmother was just fear was in her face.
In the 1960s and 70s, the Pacific Northwest was embroiled in a war. It came with all the trappings of the other civil rights wars of the era: civil disobedience, peaceful protest, state intransigence, police brutality, etc. Except this was not a war over integration versus segregation, over voting rights or intermarriage, over where a person could live or where their kids could go to school. This was a war over fish. Welcome to Indigenous History Now, the channel where we discuss the history of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, primarily focusing on the lands that would become the United States. Since this is a controversy over treaty rights, let's give a brief introduction into Indigenous treaty law and how it works in the United States. First off, what is a treaty? A treaty is a binding international agreement made between two independent sovereign countries. Think the Treaty of Friendship between the United Kingdom and Portugal, which has been in effect since 1373. They are not made between a national government and a subordinate domestic administrative unit. For example, the US government does not make treaties with its individual states. There aren't any treaties between the federal government and, say, Virginia. This is because states are domestic administrative entities subordinate to the federal government. They are not foreign sovereign nations. So what about tribes? Why does the US government have treaties with indigenous tribes? Most Americans would not consider tribes foreign sovereign nations. However, most Americans would be wrong. Before European empires colonized North America, the indigenous societies here were organized into independent sovereign countries with governments and laws and diplomacy and the whole kit and caboodle. European empires thus engaged in treaties with tribal governments as sovereign states, a tradition which the United States continued. Even when the US considered a tribe to be within its territorial boundaries, it still engaged with that tribe as a sovereign, semi-foreign nation and still made treaties with tribes until ending that policy in 1871. Now, I'm glossing over a lot of nuance and colonialist machinations in the tribal-federal relationship that will be covered in much greater detail in other videos, but suffice it to say, the United States government, still to this day, recognizes tribes as distinct, semi-autonomous sovereign entities. The US does not consider tribes to be foreign nations, hence why you don't see indigenous American tribes represented at the UN, for example, but rather, quote, domestic dependent nations. Still a sort of sovereign nation nonetheless. They are under the authority of the federal government, but they are not under the authority of any state government, and they have a little more legal autonomy than state governments, such as the ability to negotiate treaties with the federal government. Even though the United States stopped negotiating new treaties with tribes in 1871, it still holds all Indigenous treaties ratified prior to that date as active and valid. And it could, at any point in time, decide to once again negotiate new treaties with tribes. In the US Constitution, treaties have as much legal authority as federal laws passed by Congress and the Constitution itself. In other words, the US government can be sued in court and compelled to abide by the provisions of a treaty if it is not doing so. Also, state laws have no authority over the rights granted in treaties, and state governments have no jurisdiction over what happens on Indigenous reservations. Now, the federal government can always abrogate a treaty if it doesn't want to abide by it anymore. If the government wants to change the law, it can change the law, but it has to do so explicitly through an act of Congress. It can't just violate a treaty without first formally abrogating it. Politicians and everyday Americans over the years have tried numerous times to get the government to abrogate all Indigenous treaties, but thankfully, this has not been done. Some treaties have been successfully abrogated, but the vast majority are still in force, and the government is still legally required to abide by their provisions. Now to address the sticky question of the special rights. The education system throughout most of the US, and only until very recently pretty much all of it, quite intentionally omits meaningful discussion of Indigenous history and law. This leaves a vacuum of information which gets filled with misinformation, commonly held stereotypes, and widespread anti-Indigenous racist beliefs. Thus, many Americans, largely not understanding the legal status of tribes and treaties, accuse the government of favoritism towards Indigenous peoples and allege that they get special rights in these treaties. I'm certain all of my Indigenous viewers are rolling their eyes right now because you guys know better than anybody, y'all have never been treated with favoritism by the US government. The rights preserved in treaties are not benevolent gifts that the US government has bestowed upon their favorite ethnicity. The treaty negotiation process was not one of the US government giving unearned privileges to tribes. It was the tribes who gave unearned privileges to the United States. Before colonization, tribes were independent sovereign nations. This was their land, and they exercised every right that a sovereign government has to exercise over their land. They hunted and fished and lived and gathered and traveled in all the places and in all the quantities they saw appropriate. When the US came onto the scene and began making treaties with tribes, they asked tribal nations to give up access to the vast majority, if not all, of their land base for settlement by white Americans. In return, the US agreed to compensate the tribes for that lost land. This compensation took many forms in different treaties. Sometimes it was actual money. More often, it was material goods adding up to a certain monetary value, things like food, blankets, furs, etc. Sometimes in a lump sum, sometimes in annuities, sometimes in perpetuity. Indigenous negotiators were very shrewd. Many realized that if you're going to ask us to give up access to our land for eternity, you're going to pay us for that lost land and all of the lost prosperity from that land for eternity. This isn't in every treaty, probably not even in the majority, though it is in many, and the US has certainly never held up its end of the bargain. Frequently, compensation took the form of reserved rights. Many tribes being hunter-gatherer societies, the reservations that the US wanted to confine them to just weren't big enough to access the food resources necessary to make a living or even survive. Especially when the US had let's call it a habit, of coincidentally choosing the worst, most uninhabitable tracts of land for reservations. Funny how that works. Therefore, many tribal leaders across the continent made sure that their access to traditional off-reservation hunting and gathering sites was preserved in their treaties. Again, this isn't a special right that the US government gave to Indigenous peoples. This is a right that they had been practicing unmolested for centuries to millennia that they are ensuring they could continue to practice. Reservations themselves are not special land that the US gave to Indigenous tribes. Reservations are a reserved portion of a tribe's land that they get to keep in exchange for giving up all the rest of it. Many tribes weren't even fortunate enough to have reservations in their traditional land base. Many were deported to a completely different part of the continent, where they reserved a tract of land in somebody else's country in exchange for giving up the entirety of their own country. Rights reserved in treaties are both compensation for the land lost to the US and an attempt by tribal leaders to preserve some modicum of the standard of living they had before colonization. Please let me know in the comments if this discussion of treaties and treaty rights was understandable. I tried to make it as clear as possible, but it is a topic with both lots of nuance and lots of public misconceptions, and I want to make sure I'm contributing to understanding more than confusion. We'll be talking about treaties quite a bit on this channel, so let me know anything about this topic you still find perplexing, and I'll address your thoughts in subsequent videos. And I probably don't need to say this to my audience, but please be kind to each other in the comments. I want this channel to be a place where we dispel misconceptions and help people come to better understandings about complicated topics, so I need people to be able to feel safe about expressing what they don't understand. Alternatively, if you're just going to use my comment section as a place to be angry and racist and you're not seeking to listen or learn, I will delete your comments. Alright, let's get to the history. From 1854 to 1856, Isaac Stevens, territorial governor of Washington, concluded 9 treaties with tribes throughout what is today the states of Washington, parts of central Idaho, eastern Oregon, and western Montana. Washington and Oregon were both a bit bigger back then. These treaties are the Treaty of Neah Bay, the Treaty of Olympia, also known as the Quinault Treaty, the Treaty of Point No Point, the Treaty of Medicine Creek, the Treaty of Point Elliott, the Treaty of Hellgate, the Treaty with the Yakimas, the Treaty with the Nez Perces, and the Treaty with the Walla Wallas. These last 2 treaties, the Nez Perce and Walla Walla treaties, covered lands that crossed the border between the Washington and Oregon territories. Thus, Stevens was joined by the Oregon Territorial Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Joel Palmer. Palmer later went on to conclude a final 10th treaty on his own, the Treaty with the Tribes of Middle Oregon, also known as the Wasco or Warm Springs Treaty. For the tribes living throughout this region, both on the coast and in the interior, fishing was a vital part of their livelihoods. A large portion, if not the vast majority, of people's diets in all of these tribes came from the water. Go watch my video on the Northwest Coast Culture Zone for more detail, and on the Plateau Culture Zone when that one comes out. Consequently, the tribes wanted to protect their access to traditional fishing sites, and all 10 of these treaties contain a provision to that effect. In the Treaty of Point No Point, it reads as follows. The right of taking fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary houses for the purpose of curing, together with the privilege of hunting and gathering roots and berries on open and unclaimed lands. Provided, however, that they shall not take shellfish from any beds staked or cultivated by citizens. This provision reads pretty much the same in all the treaties, the only differences being that some treaties mention a right to pasturing horses and cattle on public land, some don't mention the shellfish bit, and the Neah Bay Treaty with the Macaw explicitly protects their right of whaling and sealing as well. Stevens, wanting to conclude the process rather quickly, used the same basic text and provisions over and over again, and Palmer followed suit with the Wasco Treaty, so there's really very little difference between any of these treaties. They all confine the region's indigenous inhabitants to prescribed reservations, but this provision reserves their right to fish outside of reservation boundaries at, quote, usual and accustomed grounds and stations. Basically, indigenous people can fish wherever they've always fished, whether it be on or off the reservation. The treaties also reserve other off-reservation hunting and gathering rights, but those are a bit more restricted than the fishing right. There's actually quite a bit that the tribes fought for in these treaties. Stevens originally wanted to deport all the tribes living west of the Cascades to a reservation east of the mountains. When this wasn't possible, he tried confining them all to a single reservation along the coast. Only begrudgingly did he establish several reservations scattered throughout western Washington, more in line with the tribes' traditional territories. I digress. For the next couple decades, Northwest native fishers were able to carry on much as they always had. By the 1890s, however, the increasing population of non-natives and the environmental degradation they brought with industrialization was already putting major stress on the region's fisheries. And that's when the trouble started. Quick disclaimer before we continue, even though tribes throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana all have treaty-reserved fishing rights and all had disputes with their respective state governments over those rights, this video will focus on the states of Oregon and Washington. The way the fishing rights issue played out in Idaho and Montana was quite different from how it played out in Oregon and Washington, so those will be stories for another day. Now back to the show. Let's detour for a second and talk about salmon habitat. Salmon, as we all know, is an anadromous fish, as well as steelhead trout. They're part of this story too. They're born in fresh water, swim to the ocean where they mature, then return to their streams of birth to reproduce and start the cycle over again. Sounds simple, but they actually have some pretty specific environmental requirements, and changes to even a handful of factors can have major impacts on their population. First, there's the location of birth. Not just any fresh water will do. They prefer cold, running water, not too deep, but not too shallow. So lakes are out because they get too warm, too stagnant, and too deep, and streams and rivers are in. The water needs to be clean and clear. Too much sediment deprives the eggs of oxygen. I probably don't need to mention that chemical pollutants and toxins are also no good. The stream bed needs to be gravelly, not sandy. There needs to be a good current, but not so much that it disturbs the gravel. There also can't be too many eggs laid in one location. They'll just suffocate each other, so the adults need to spread out before they lay. Hence why some salmon will swim the entire length of a river, even if it means going thousands of miles into the continent. Once the eggs hatch, the hatchlings don't immediately swim to the sea. Depending on the species, they spend anywhere from 6 months to 3 years in fresh water first. During the younger stages, they need obstructions such as fallen branches and trees to provide cover from predators. As they age, they gradually make their way downstream and into the ocean. But first they need to go through a critically important stage of living in brackish water estuary environments to acclimatize themselves to salt water. After anywhere from 1 to 6 years of living in the ocean, they will swim back upstream in their millions to lay eggs in their hundreds of millions. Given how many links there are in this chain that need to go exactly right for a salmon to survive to adulthood, and how many predators out there love to eat them along the way, only around 0.001% of all eggs laid make it to reproduction. When counting the number of hatchlings that make it to sexual maturity, the number does increase, to a whopping 2%. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, logging was, and still is today, a major industry in the Pacific Northwest, and the techniques of the time were less than environmentally sound. Clear cutting was the order of the day, and thousands of acres were laid waste in just a matter of decades with no thought whatsoever put into any sort of preservation or management strategies. The timber barons hated the C word, dreaded the R word, and viciously fought against both: conservation and regulation. In fact, when Olympic National Park was established in 1938 and hundreds of thousands of acres of old-growth forest suddenly rendered off limits to them, the logging bosses got so pissed off that they made a point of clear-cutting every acre of forest they owned on the Olympic Peninsula right up to the new park's boundaries. To this day, these forests are still recovering, and if you go on Google Maps and hit satellite image, you can see the boundary between the park and private property just by the condition of the tree cover. All of this logging severely damaged riverine ecology. Trees provide shade that helps keep water cool. Remove the trees, and the streams start getting too warm. The root system of a living forest also helps to keep the ground stable and prevent erosion. Removing the trees, and even worse, dragging them across the ground, loosens soil on a massive scale that would then clog rivers with mud when it rained, suffocating fish and smothering their eggs. Agriculture also degraded salmon habitat. Fertilizer and waste from livestock makes its way into the waterways, causing eutrophication and again, suffocating the fish. Irrigation can take so much water out of the rivers that there's not enough left to support fish populations. Development, for either industrial or residential purposes, drained some waterways, especially estuaries, rerouted others, and polluted pretty much all of them. For example, near their mouths, the Puyallup River that runs east of Tacoma and the Duwamish River that runs through Seattle both used to act like every other natural river that runs through a wide, flat basin. They used to bend and braid and curve across wide estuary floodplains and over time change course. But in the decades of the early 20th century, both were heavily modified. The Duwamish was dredged to allow for commercial ship traffic, and both were straightened through a series of dams, levees, and dikes, and their floodplains drained and filled. Thus, the winding natural rivers were each reduced to a narrow single channel that they now flow through today. This destroyed two estuary environments, which, as explained, is a critical stage in the salmon life cycle, but also concentrating this incredible volume of water into a narrow channel dramatically increases the strength of the current. This means all the gravel on the riverbed that salmon need to lay their eggs is now getting continually washed away. The bottoms of both these rivers for several miles up from their mouths are no longer gravelly, they're sandy. It doesn't help either that the Duwamish still gets regularly dredged. Likewise, Lake Washington to the east of Seattle used to drain into the Duwamish through the Black River on its southern shore. However, in 1916, with the opening of the Lake Washington Ship Canal through Lake Union, the level of Lake Washington dropped and the Black River dried up. I could make an entire channel chronicling all the habitat-destroying development that has taken place over the years, and I haven't even talked about pollution. Perhaps the biggest single contributor to salmon habitat destruction, however, is the proliferation of dams. In 2023, there are at least 1,166 dams in Washington and another 481 in Oregon, and depending on what kind of dams you're counting, there are a lot more than that. Dams stop the whole course of a river at a single location, and unless you have some way of routing the salmon around them, they block access to the entire upstream course of that river and all of its upstream tributaries, preventing the use of tens of thousands of miles of productive spawning beds. Yes, there are things like fish ladders or salmon wheels, but these have never worked as well as intended in allowing salmon to pass dams. It's a simple fact that you are never going to fit through a tiny little fish ladder as many fish as can pass through the entire width of the river. It's just physically impossible. And many dams can't even accommodate fish ladders. The largest dam in Washington, Grand Coulee, is too tall for a fish ladder and shuts off salmon access to over 1,000 miles of river. Considering that many rivers have multiple dams along their course, such as the Columbia, which has 14, or the Snake, which has 20, this compounds the problem exponentially and creates our modern reality where thousands of spawning grounds haven't seen a salmon in decades or even a century. Dams also create massive reservoirs of still, warm water, the exact opposite of what salmon eggs need in cool, flowing water. But warm water isn't just a threat to salmon reproduction. Adult salmon themselves are very sensitive to temperature fluctuations. Prolonged exposure to water temperatures as high as 68 degrees can be lethal to cold water fish like salmon. Detouring from salmon for a second, dams also destroy important cultural sites for Indigenous peoples. When the Dalles Dam was finished in 1957, it buried Cholilo Falls under its reservoir. This was probably the single most important fishing location along the entire Columbia for tribes across the region. It also hosted a town that was one of the continent's major trading hubs, connecting goods and people from the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, and even Alaska to traders from California, the Southwest, the Great Plains, and the Missouri Basin. The loss of Cholilo Falls was a devastating blow that is felt across Columbia Basin tribes to this day. As if all of this habitat destruction isn't enough, there's also the contribution of the commercial fishing industry, which started to become big business in the 1860s, feeding not just the local non-native population, but other parts of the country and world as well. In 1866, Hapgood Hume & Co. established the first cannery on the Columbia River, and that year packed 272,000 pounds of fish. By 1883, the Columbia River catch was over 42 million pounds. To put this in perspective, the catch in 1995 was less than 1 million pounds. In 1883, there were 39 canneries along the Columbia. In Canada, 40 canneries were in operation in 1900 just along the Fraser River. Just like the timber barons, the fish barons had no self-control and frequently caught more fish than the canneries could handle, which didn't start imposing landing limits until the mid-1880s. The excess, now dead, were just dumped back into the water. As much as 7 million pounds in 1895 alone. That is 7 times more waste than the entire catch in 1995. These dead fish would wash ashore and rot, providing food for bears and seagulls, yes, but also a breeding ground for infectious diseases like typhoid. Astoria, Oregon had an unfavorable reputation for its ever-present stench of rotting fish. To give a bit of perspective of how out of control the fishing industry was, Oregon's first game regulations were enacted in 1872, banning the use of explosives and poisons to catch fish. In 1887, the U.S. Senate tasked the Army with investigating the alarming reports of overfishing in the region. Lead investigator Major W.A. Jones said in his report that the fishing was so intense between April and August that it was, quote, a sort of miracle that any fish escaped to go up the river. The combined forces of habitat destruction and commercial overfishing decimated fish stocks of all species, quickly creating a need for regulation. Already by 1877, the first hatchery was opened along Oregon's Clackamas River to augment the declining natural populations. By 1900, certain types of gear were being banned as annual catch numbers were down by the millions, and entire fisheries of several species had already been spent. Things only got worse from here as the human population increased, and with it the stressors on the salmon runs.
Yeah, the state fishery, they were always really against us. They were totally against us. And that's where they, even up here, they, on the shallow, they'd always give us a bad time. Come on, you get back up there on the res. And but then when our beat saints were out there legal on the res, fishing on the res, then you'd have about 3-4 state patrol, really fast, heavy boats. Just coming. They'd run them as tight as they can to the net, running to kind of scare the fish out.
It didn't take long for the interests of indigenous and non-indigenous fishers to come into conflict, and it was the indigenous fishers who usually lost out. The commercial fishers recognized a few facts. First, indigenous fishers knew how and where to fish, and they did it very well. Thus, they quickly adopted a number of indigenous techniques and gear, notably the use of gill nets, purse seines, and fish traps to great effect. Fish traps were a favorite in the Puget Sound. These were large and elaborate series of nets that could be acres in size and stretch several miles long that funneled whole schools of fish into holding pens where they could be easily harvested. They were so popular and devastatingly effective that commercial fishers who used other techniques, notably boat-based netters, successfully lobbied to get their use banned in the 1930s. In fact, there was even a short-lived piracy problem in the Puget Sound centered around people stealing fish from these fish traps. Secondly, the commercial fishers could get away with mistreating indigenous fishers much more easily than other white fishers. White commercial fishers of all stripes loved to fish in the preferred locations of indigenous fishers, both because those were the most productive spots and because nobody had any qualms about stealing their turf. In the commercial fishing industry, good real estate can be the difference between feast or famine, and in many fisheries back then and still today, there's a code of ethics amongst boat captains. You don't swipe somebody else's spot, not without permission. This isn't a legal requirement, but a very closely held rule of etiquette. Just try taking a guy's spot and see what happens. Unfortunately, in the early 1900s, it was a courtesy not extended to indigenous fishers, and if ever there was a turf war between white boat captains, it could always be resolved by kicking some poor native guy out of his spot. Of course, indigenous people's ability to fish in their traditional locations was a treaty-protected right, but the boat captains didn't care, and neither did the states. Thus, indigenous fishers saw their catches dwindle as the number of locations accessible to them declined. It was also difficult for indigenous fishers to compete economically with modern vessels. Bigger boats with bigger nets, bigger holds, and better engines that enabled them to travel farther and stay out longer. It wasn't that indigenous people didn't want to use modern technology, they just couldn't afford to. These vessels were expensive. White fishers bought them with loans from the bank. Indigenous people were legally prohibited from getting bank loans. All of these obstacles meant that by 1900, indigenous activity made up only 12% of the commercial fishing industry. Even though they comprised only a small sliver of the industry and it was demonstrable that their activities were not the ones causing major damage to the fisheries, these facts didn't stop white fishers from blaming indigenous fishers for all of their problems. Consequently, whenever the states made regulations, these regulations targeted indigenous people first and foremost. A tradition which began early and continued all the way up through the 70s was banning gear that only indigenous people used, such as weirs, certain configurations of line, and eventually nets in any freshwater body outside of the Columbia, and exempting gear that mostly non-Indigenous fishers used, such as hook and line angling. Considering that Indigenous communities were already poor and that the more they got shut out of the fishing industry, the worse their economic prospects became, Indigenous fishers couldn't just replace their gear to comply with the law. That was expensive, prohibitively expensive. These gear restrictions effectively forced Indigenous people to either stop fishing or risk arrest in doing so. Another discriminatory law of the early days was one that required a license to fish, and required a person to be a U.S. citizen to get a license. Most Indigenous people were not granted citizenship until 1924. These lawmakers knew exactly what they were doing. And it wasn't like the non-Indigenous commercial fishers didn't know that they were the problem. They just wanted to shift the blame to avoid regulation. Numerous reports in the late 1800s from multiple sources, be it the 1887 U.S. Senate report quoted earlier, or an 1894 report from the U.S. Commission on Fish and Fisheries, etc., all put the blame squarely at the feet of both dams and other environmental destructions and the commercial fishing industry. And reports of this nature would continue getting published consistently up until the present day. Now, don't get me wrong. The commercial and sport fishing worlds of 2023, even 1973, are significantly more regulated places than they were in 1893. I'm not saying that non-native fishers have never been subject to regulation, just that, for decades, they were successfully able to shift blame and therefore the focus and onus of regulation away from themselves and onto Indigenous fishers. This was because the commercial and especially the sport fishing industries had very powerful lobbies in state legislatures, whereas Indigenous fishers did not. This made them a cheap and easy scapegoat. These fish lobbies were able to delay, curtail, and influence regulation of their respective industries for quite a long time. A little anecdote to give you a perspective of the power of these lobby groups. In Washington, from 1932 to 1994, commercial fishing activity was regulated by the Department of Fisheries, and sport activity by the Department of Game. They were merged together in 1994 into the modern Department of Fish and Wildlife. The Department of Game was headed by a 6-member board of directors appointed by the governor called the Game Commission. The preeminent lobby group for the sport fishing industry is the Washington State Sportsmen's Council, founded in 1934. From the Sportsmen's Council's inception in 1934 until 1970, and this could very well have gone on for longer because the source I got this fact from was only published in 1970, with the exception of the term of a single governor, every member of the Game Commission was selected from a slate of options presented to the Washington governors by the Sportsmen's Council. For nearly 40 years, every member of the governing body of the department responsible for regulating the sport fishing industry was handpicked by the preeminent lobby group of the sport fishing industry. You can bet that had an influence on what sort of regulations the Department of Game was instituting and enforcing, and against whom. The targeting of Indigenous fishers, though, was clearly not only the result of who had a lobby group and who didn't. There was also no small amount of racism leveled in their direction. Sometimes the legislatures would let up on the discriminatory policies, but fish commissioners and game wardens would go out of their way to ignore or change policies set by the legislature and more aggressively target Indigenous fishers. One fish commissioner / game warden, L.H. Darwin, who occupied the post from 1913 to 1921, was so aggressively anti-Indigenous that Indigenous people today still remember this man's name. He directly blamed Indigenous fishers for the declining salmon population, regularly arrested them and stole their gear, and had no regard for even the concept of treaty rights. He was so bad that in 1914, the Indian agent for the Tulee Reservation wrote a report formally protesting the state's, quote, discriminatory game and fishery laws. And if you've watched my General Indigenous History Summary Part 2 video, you'll know that Indian agents weren't exactly paragons of Indigenous rights and pro-treaty virtue. Here's a quote from his report. The natives' natural larders have been chiefly the shellfish and fisher locations adjacent to the mouths of the great rivers of this vicinity. These resources have been sufficient to subsist and maintain our Indian people hitherto. These resources have naturally lessened with the advent of the white man. More recently, the use of large capital, mechanized assistance, numerous great traps, canneries, etc., and other activities allied to the fishery industry have greatly lessened and depleted the Indians' natural sources of food supply. In addition thereto, the stringent and harsh application to Indians of the state game and fish laws have made it still and increasingly precarious for him to procure his natural foods in his natural way. Much of this has been done under the color of law. An empty larder, however, is an empty larder. The pinch of poverty and hunger are nonetheless severe because the man who has taken your means of subsistence has done so under the color of law and the appearance of legal right. The Indian is aware of no defect, default, or transgression on his part. Ergo, he argues, it must be that transgression is upon the part of the white man, post hoc propter hoc. One by one, his richer and remoter fisher locations have been stripped from him, while the law held him helpless and resourceless. By the 1930s and accelerating in the 1950s, language used in both public conversation and by government agencies was becoming increasingly racialized against Indigenous people. There was a common depiction in the press of Indigenous fishers as greedy fishmongers who wanted to harvest every single last living fish with no care whatsoever for conservation or continuation of the resource. Ironic considering that by 1940 only 2.8% of salmon in the Puget Sound were caught by Indigenous fishers. The treaty not only permitted off-reservation Indigenous fishing, but reserved on-reservation fishing exclusively for tribal members. Non-natives could fish in the same places as natives off the res, but couldn't fish on the res. This, of course, they did not like, with many non-native sport fishers aggressively lobbying, unsuccessfully, for access to on-reservation fishing grounds. They were more successful, however, in getting Washington to classify steelhead trout as an exclusively game species in 1947, the only such classification in the nation. As mentioned before, steelhead, though not a salmon, are anadromous, and before 1947 were treated by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishers and regulators no different than salmon. Thus, after this date, Indigenous fishers still caught steelhead for commercial purposes as they always had, though now in violation of the law. The big change came in the 1930s when Oregon and Washington declared all freshwater bodies, except the Columbia River, off limits to commercial activity. Freshwater was now exclusively a venue for sport fishing. This was a major blow to Indigenous fishers because Indigenous people weren't fishing for sport. They were fishing commercially to feed and support their families. We're talking about impoverished communities here. Poverty is still a problem throughout most Indigenous communities today, and back then it was even worse. For families who had the access and the gear, fishing was a way to survive. And you can't abide by sport fishing regulations and catch enough fish to support a household. Sport regulations usually have strict seasons of only a few months out of the year for any given species, or even the whole fishery, permit only a handful of fish a day, and limit gear to basically just hook and line angling. Considering that once salmon start their run up the rivers, they usually don't eat anymore, it's really difficult to catch a salmon during the run with a hook and bait. Thus, Indigenous fishers were forced to fish in violation of the state's regulations. They would fish out of season, used unapproved gear like nets, catch more than the legal limit, operate without a license, etc. All because, again, they were not fishing for recreation. But unsurprisingly, the non-native fishers didn't see it this way. Already racist attitudes were supercharged, with non-native sport fishers now complaining that Indigenous people were thugs and criminals who just want to flout the law. Why can't they just be good, law-abiding Americans? The already antagonistic relationship with game authorities got even worse. Wardens would arrest fishers, confiscate gear and hold boats, impose fines, etc. And often they weren't very nice about it. Boats were rammed, nets cut, and fishers beaten and manhandled in the course of an arrest. Keep in mind that women fished almost as frequently as men and didn't get any better treatment by the police. All of this was economically ruinous for already impoverished Indigenous fishers. Even if a fisher challenged their arrest in court on treaty grounds and won, a highly unlikely and infrequent occurrence, legal battles could take months or years to resolve. All the while, their irreplaceable gear was held by the state, rendering them unable to fish. The economic toll meant that even one run-in with the law could drive an Indigenous fisher out of business, and in most communities, there were few to no good alternatives they could turn to for work. A fair amount of Northwest reservations are in pretty rural areas. Additionally, in Washington, especially in the 50s and 60s, the state habitually pressured fish merchants away from doing business with Indigenous fishers, or at least buying their catch well below market value. It wasn't just the lawman either. Angry and racist sport fishers were known to harass Indigenous fishers, and they could almost be more aggressive than the police. Silas Cross, vice chairman of the Puyallup tribe in the late 60s, once stated, quote, "During the fishing seasons, the Indians dare not leave the river, because the sportsmen smash our boats and rip our nets, steal our motors, in order to get revenge on the Indians." Many Indigenous fishers turned to fishing at night in small groups and even carrying a gun for protection. Not taking any of this lying down, amidst the rampant harassment and discrimination, Indigenous fishers took to the courts for justice.
They started going to jail. There were fights along the river. I mean, these guys were out to hurt you. They weren't just doing simple things. They wanted to hurt you, and they wanted to hurt you bad. They'd carry these long flashlights, and it was like they were terrorizing the Indians. It was really a hard time and a real struggle, and that's what's so angry is when these guys went to jail, we sat home and we starved as families, but, it didn't matter to them. But I think the battles were hard. It was hard on families. And it wasn't, just Nugie. It was Nugie's kids, Nugie's wife, Babe's family, and Billy's family and Don McLeod's family. The kids are crying because their dads are being hit over the head. They're being put in jail, because the state thinks they have the right to tell Indian people what to do. And grandparents were having to watch kids, because when they could no longer fight, then the women had to go out and fight, like Jeanette, Suzanne Sataika, Maisel Bridges, Allison, Suzette, Billy Louise and us. We would all go out there and we would try to do the fight, with the state of Washington. And when we got done, we didn't have anything. They took our boats, they took our nets. Did they take the fish too?
Yeah.
They just took everything from you.
Turning to the courts was not a new idea. Indigenous fishers had been trying for decades by the 1930s. It's just that before the mid-30s, local courts would usually throw out the cases and refuse to hear them. The tribes would try to appeal to the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, who needed to get the cooperation of the Department of Justice, the DOJ. And the DOJ was no more interested in Indigenous rights cases than the local courts and would lean on the BIA to drop the issue. One major case did make it to litigation in this period, U.S. v. Winans in 1905. Linnaeus and Audubon Winans were non-native brothers with a homestead near Cholilo Falls. They operated a series of commercial fish wheels along the Columbia River, harvesting devices that could catch salmon by the ton. They'd obtained licenses to operate them from the state of Washington and bought the land that the fish wheels sat on. The Winans brothers' land blocked access to fishing locations along the river that Yakima tribal members asserted were their usual and accustomed grounds. However, the brothers were not inclined to allow Indigenous fishers to cross their property, and had brought multiple trespassing suits against tribal members for doing so. The issue of the case regarded the origin of treaty rights and their relationship to rights granted by the state. The Winans brothers, and the state of Washington, contested that the phrase "in common with," as in the right of taking fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations, is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, meant that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people had the same right to fish. Ergo, that the state could qualify or eliminate the fishing rights of Indigenous people the same way it qualifies the fishing rights of non-Indigenous people. In this case, if Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishing rights are the same, then property rights take precedence, and a property owner can exclude people from crossing their land, even if doing so means inhibiting that person's right to fish. A previous land access case of pretty much the same nature as this had already been decided in the Yakima tribe's favor in 1887, U.S. v. Taylor. However, that was before Washington was a state. Now that it was a full-fledged state, Washington argued that its status as a state meant it didn't have to uphold the rights reserved in Indigenous treaties. The court stated the issue like this. The pivot of the controversy is on the construction of the second paragraph. Respondents contend that the words, the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places, in common with the citizens of the territory, confer only such rights as a white man would have under the conditions of ownership of the lands bordering on the river and under the laws of the state, and, such being the rights conferred, the respondents further contend that they have the power to exclude the Indians from the river by reason of such ownership. The lower district court and the Ninth Circuit Court sided with the Winans brothers, but the Supreme Court sided with the Yakima tribe. They ruled that the Winans needed to allow Indigenous fishers an easement to cross their land in order to access their usual and accustomed fishing sites. They argued this for a couple of reasons and established two major precedents in U.S. Indigenous law. First, they found that the state could not eliminate Indigenous treaty rights because neither the state nor the federal government had granted those rights, but rather that the treaty recognized and reserved rights that already existed and were already in possession by the tribe and its members. The right to resort to the fishing places in controversy was a part of larger rights possessed by the Indians, upon the exercise of which there was not a shadow of impediment, and which were not much less necessary to the existence of the Indians than the atmosphere they breathed. New conditions came into existence to which those rights had to be accommodated. Only a limitation of them, however, was necessary and intended, not a taking away. In other words, the treaty was not a grant of rights to the Indians, but a grant of right from them, a reservation of those not granted. The court continued. At the time the treaty was made, the fishing places were part of the Indian country, subject to the occupancy of the Indians, with all the rights such occupancy gave. The object of the treaty was to limit the occupancy to certain lands and to define rights outside of them. This established the reserves rights doctrine and is still an important doctrine in Indigenous treaty law today. This is the doctrine I paraphrased in the Intro to Treaties section at the beginning of this video. Secondly, the court asserted that it would interpret the treaties not based on their strict text, but rather based on how the Indigenous signatories would have understood the agreement, stating, "We have said we will construe a treaty with the Indians as that unlettered people understood it, and as justice and reason demand, in all cases where power is exerted by the strong over those to whom they owe care and protection, and counterpoise the inequality by the superior justice which looks only to the substance of the right without regard to technical rules." In making this ruling, they cited a previous case decided in 1899, Jones v. Meehan. And paternalistic language aside, that case lays out quite well the court's reasoning for this approach. In construing any treaty between the United States and an Indian tribe, it must always be borne in mind that the negotiations for the treaty are conducted on the part of the United States, an enlightened and powerful nation, by representatives skilled in diplomacy, masters of a written language, understanding the modes and forms of creating the various technical estates known to their law, and assisted by an interpreter employed by themselves, that the treaty is drawn up by them and in their own language, that the Indians, on the other hand, are a weak and dependent people who have no written language and are wholly unfamiliar with all the forms of legal expression, and whose only knowledge of the terms in which the treaty is framed is that imparted to them by the interpreter employed by the United States, and that the treaty must therefore be construed not according to the technical meaning of its words to learned lawyers, but in the sense in which they would naturally be understood by the Indians. The language used in treaties with the Indians should never be construed to their prejudice. How the words of the treaty were understood by this unlettered people, rather than their critical meaning, should form the rule of construction. Again, paternalistic language aside, the court is making a really fair and important point here. Namely that everything in the treaty negotiation process was to the advantage of the United States and disadvantage of the tribes. Especially that these were documents of law framed for the U.S.'s legal system, not Indigenous nations' own legal systems, which they did have, that they were written in the US's language, and that the Indigenous negotiators couldn't read or write. They didn't have anyone to look over the American scribes' shoulders to scour the text word by word and make sure it was mutually agreeable. They had to trust that what had been discussed in the negotiation was what would be written on the treaty and what would be enacted by the US government. All of this was made even more difficult for Indigenous negotiators if there wasn't someone who could translate directly from English to a given tribe's language. For example, in negotiating the Treaty of Niabey with the Makah, there was nobody who spoke both English and Makah. Rather, there was someone who spoke English and Chinook jargon, someone who spoke Chinook jargon and Klallam, and someone else who spoke Klallam and Makah. Yeah, the discussions took quite a long time. Almost all the Stevens treaties had to be translated through the language of Chinook jargon, which isn't even a full language. It's a trade language with only around 500 words, none of which describe legal concepts vital to these treaties like in common with, usual and accustomed, or the idea of ceding rights. In ascertaining what Indigenous negotiators understood themselves to be agreeing to in accordance with this principle, courts have been heavily reliant on the documented minutes of the negotiations. Analyzing these, the court in Winans ruled there was no evidence to say Indigenous negotiators understood that private landholders would be able to restrict their access to their usual and accustomed off-reservation places, or that statehood would impact the exercise of these rights in any way. Thus, the court found that treaty rights to off-reservation resources still existed, had not been extinguished, and that the state had to craft regulatory schemes that honor and provide for the exercise of these rights. Although not diving deep into the implications of this, the court also considered the phrase "in common with" not to mean that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have the same nature of fishing right, but rather that it described land that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishers could have common access to. There was an exclusive right of fishing reserved within certain boundaries, on reservation. There was a right outside of those boundaries reserved in common with citizens of the territory. As a mere right, it was not exclusive in the Indians. Citizens might share it, but the Indians were secured in its enjoyment by a special provision of means for its exercise. Thus, Winans accomplished a number of things. It established that treaties were not grants of rights but reservations of rights. It furthered the doctrine of interpreting treaty provisions to Indigenous people's benefit and according to how their negotiators had understood them. It ruled that private landholders had to permit Indigenous Northwesterners to cross their land to access usual and accustomed grounds and stations, and it prohibited the state from enacting laws that completely extinguish Indigenous people's ability to exercise treaty rights. There were two major limitations to Winans, though. First, although it required landowners to respect Indigenous access to treaty fishing grounds, many landowners were disinclined to acquiesce to that request, and the states of Washington and Oregon, setting a pattern that would persist through numerous subsequent cases, didn't care enough to enforce the ruling. Thus, Indigenous fishers were left to their own devices and often had to choose between abandoning a fishing site they had a court-ordered legal right to access or confront angry and frequently violent landowners. Under these circumstances, most Indigenous fishers weren't inclined to push the issue, and even more treaty-protected fishing sites became off-limits to them. Second, and importantly for the future of the controversy, the meaning of the phrase "in common with" was still up for debate. The states would still claim that this phrase gave them authority to regulate off-reservation Indigenous fishing, whereas Indigenous fishers argued the states had no such right. Non-natives and their government representatives contended that this phrase permitted Indigenous fishers equal opportunity to take fish on the same terms and under the same regulations as non-Indigenous fishers. Anything more would be giving special rights to Indigenous peoples. The tribes disagreed, arguing that the phrase was an extension of fishing rights from natives to non-natives, an invitation that allowed non-natives to fish in the same off-reservation locations as natives, but that it wasn't an agreement to be regulated in the same way. Even though this phrase had been an aspect of the Winans case, and the court had given a definition for it, the focus in Winans was on whether this phrase allowed for off-reservation treaty fishing activity at all. not on whether the states could regulate components of that activity. The court's ruling prohibited the states from outright extinguishing the off-reservation fishing right, but it didn't address the issue of whether things like season limits, catch sizes, gear requirements, etc. could be enforced. That was a question that had to wait for a later day. Things started to change in 1934 with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act. A new era of federal Indian policy was now underway. The BIA was more supportive of tribes than it had been before, and more cooperative in its advocacy for fishing rights cases. The IRA also provided for the establishment of new tribal governments, and the majority of Northwest tribes organized IRA governments. Among the first things that many of these new tribal governments did was hire lawyers to take on fish cases. The next major case came around in 1942, Tulee v. Washington. In 1939, Samson Tulee, a Yakima tribal member, was arrested and fined for fishing off the reservation with a net and without a license. Remember, prohibiting the use of nets in fresh water was one of those gear restrictions designed to target indigenous fishers. Tulee argued that these regulations violated his treaty rights. He was convicted in state court, and his conviction upheld by the Washington Supreme Court, but overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. In the first decision to take on the question of whether and to what extent the states could regulate off-reservation treaty fishing, the court did permit state regulation, but only so far as was justifiable for conservation purposes. It ruled that licenses could be required of treaty tribal members, but the state couldn't charge a fee for them. The court advised the BIA to issue its own fishing licenses, which it then began doing for federally recognized tribes. Striking a middle ground between the state's all-regulation and Tule's no-regulation position, the court declared, "We think the state's construction of the treaty is too narrow and the appellants too broad. That while the treaty leaves the state with power to impose on Indians equally with others such restrictions of a purely regulatory nature concerning the time and manner of fishing outside the reservation as are necessary for the conservation of the fish, it forecloses the state from charging the Indians a fee of the kind in question here." Now, materially, Tulee didn't change anything. The court didn't really define with a fine-toothed comb what it meant by such restrictions as are necessary for the conservation of fish. And you may be thinking, why should they need to define that? That seems pretty clear. Well, you, dear viewer, and the court, both have made the critical error of assuming that the states of Washington and Oregon on this issue were good faith actors. Setting another pattern that would persist through multiple cases, Washington and Oregon saw a loophole, and they took it. They continued making and enforcing the same discriminatory regulations, this time merely slapping the label of necessary for conservation on them as a justification. As far as the states were concerned, the ruling was a victory. For the next 20 years, numerous further cases regarding these discriminatory regulations came before the courts. Each time, the court had the option of making a broad-scope ruling that would set new precedent and potentially change the state's behavior, or a narrow-scope ruling that would merely slap down the particular regulation in question, but not prevent the creation or enforcement of other discriminatory statutes. And until the late 60s, the courts consistently chose to make narrow-scope rulings. Thus, the state governments continued their exploitation of Tule's conservation loophole unabated. The closest a court came to a broad-scope ruling was State v. Satiacum in 1957. Robert, better known as Bob Satiacum, was a Puyallup tribal member and fisher, and in 1954 was arrested for fishing in violation of Washington regulations. Most fishers who were arrested before 1963 were not protest fishing. Bob, however, was, and he was hoping to get a court case out of it that would finally resolve the issue. He was convicted by a lower court, but his conviction overturned by the Washington State Supreme Court. Even though the court had agreed to overturn his conviction, their reasoning to do so was split 4-4, meaning it didn't establish new precedent. Half the court wanted to make a broad-scope ruling saying that treaty rights are superior to state police power and that the state doesn't have any right to regulate off-reservation fishing. The other half, however, wanted simply to make a narrow-scope ruling saying that the state had just once again failed to abide by Tulee. If just one more justice on this court had changed their vote, this video may have been about the Satiacum decision rather than the Boldt decision. Alas, it was not to be, and the issue would remain unresolved for another 17 years. Allow me to take a brief detour to talk about an incident tangentially related to the fish wars, though mostly I'm including it because I feel bad I forgot to mention it in my PNW history video. The Nisqually Reservation, as originally established in the 1850s, encompassed some 4,700 acres of land along both banks of the Nisqually River, a few miles upstream from the river's mouth. In 1916, amidst World War I fervor, a private training camp was set up on the south shore of American Lake, southwest of Tacoma and northeast of the reservation. Local politicians and businessmen, excited by the economic prospects of development, got the idea to invite the U.S. Army to establish a full-blown installation at the site. Pierce County sent a committee to D.C. and pitched the idea of donating 70,000 acres to the War Department if they would build a permanent base. They agreed. Pierce County bought up 62,000 acres of land that it donated to the Army, and construction began on Fort Lewis the following year. The problem was, of the 8,000 acres that remained to be acquired, 3,300 consisted of Nisqually Reservation land, the entire east bank of the reservation. The geography of the location was desirable to the Army for artillery practice. Even though the land was at this point not theirs, Base Commander General James Iron had troops training and firing artillery on the reservation by October of 1917, destroying many Nisqually farms and homes. With the support of Pierce County voters, in February of 1918, the county began condemnation proceedings against all Nisqually residents on the East Bank. Let me make something very clear. County governments have absolutely, positively no authority, no jurisdiction, no say, no claim, no interest, no nothing over reservation land. They can't tax it, they can't regulate activities on it, they can't do any sort of law enforcement on it, and they sure as shingles can't buy, sell, or condemn it. Only Congress can approve any sort of change to reservation boundaries, and Pierce County evicted 21 Nisqually families and stole 70% of the Nisqually Reservation with no congressional approval. It was completely illegal. They stole the land and gave it to the Army. The tribe appraised the value of the stolen land at $93,000, but Pierce County only agreed to pay $75,000. The families were given 2 weeks' notice to vacate, and those who didn't were forced out of their homes by bayonet-armed soldiers in the middle of the night. I'm not exaggerating here. They literally appeared in the dead of night rather than in the daytime for some reason. The families couldn't all fit on the remainder of the reservation, so many were forced to settle on other reservations or outside the reservation boundaries entirely. The incident did get Congress's attention, but rather than giving the land back in 1921, they paid the displaced families another $65,000 in recognition that they'd been underpaid by Pierce County. This land is still occupied by the Army today, now part of Joint Base Lewis McChord, and the Nisqually Reservation still encompasses only 30% of its original extent. For families that had moved off but close to a reservation, Congress also agreed to hold their land in trust, the official status of Indigenous-owned land that prevents it from being sold, though it wasn't officially incorporated into any reservation. That definition of trust land is an oversimplification, but we'll get to that another time. One of the affected families was the Frank family. Billy Frank Sr. took his cut and bought a 6-acre property on the banks of the Nisqually River a bit over a mile north of the reservation. He named it Frank's Landing, and it, himself, and his son Billy Frank Jr. would all be major players in the fish wars to come.
Took my wife to the hospital in Seattle, and on the way back home, I was listening to the radio, and they were saying, well, there's a big war going on in Puyallup. So I pulled off the road there, just where the road is, where the railroad bridge, then the old bridge on the other side. I got down there, and there was State Patrol, SWAT teams from Tacoma, fish and game, not the fisheries, but the game department. And I suppose the fisheries was there too. And when I got out of my car, man, that tear gas hit my face. It was already gone, but it was still strong. So I walked over there. There was about 3 or 4 white people standing there watching too, and everybody kind of pulled out. I said, "Oh, I gotta go see who's down there, if anybody got hurt or what's going on." So I went down there, and the first one I ran into was old Hank Adams. I was only there about 15, 20 minutes, and there was Billy Frank. Hank says, "If I were you, I wouldn't stick around too long. We're going to burn that bridge." They went over and they had diesel and gas. They poured it all around the base of that bridge. So I walked around downstream and then back around and got back to the railroad track, and then ka-whoom. Man, that gas and that bridge. I thought that bridge was all burned up. It didn't even hurt it.
The seeds of the fish wars stretch back a whole century, but the match that would set it ablaze was lit in the 1950s. The non-native population of the Northwest was rapidly growing in the post-war period, contributing to even further declines in fish populations. Simultaneously, the region became a popular tourist destination for sport fishermen from across the country awash with fat post-war paychecks to burn. The iconically 50s attitudes of conformity when directed at Indigenous peoples led to the termination policy. America returned to its desire to see Indigenous people assimilate into oblivion and its classic disinterest in honoring treaty rights, now frequently seen as irrelevant 100-year-old documents. When faced with the realities of too many fishers and not enough fish, somebody had to take the blame. The catch numbers recorded from 1958 to 1967 tell us a pretty clear story about who was responsible for the dismal state of the Northwest's fisheries. In that decade, just under 7% of all fish in Washington were caught by Indigenous fishers, both commercially and recreationally. 12% went to non-Indigenous sport fishers, and 81% of the catch was done by the non-Indigenous commercial fishing industry. It seems pretty clear who was taking the lion's share of the fish, and who the states should regulate most heavily to rebuild their population. Indians. Yes, that's right. As had been tradition for decades, Indigenous fishers were scapegoated and blamed in the media and the government for the sorry state of fishing in the Northwest. Racist talking points that smeared Indigenous fishers as law-hating criminals with no self-control who wanted to kill every last fish became even more virulent. Violent encounters between racist sport fishers and Indigenous fishers became more commonplace. As a law and order Congress increased police funding available to states, the Northwest states put their cash to work, even more aggressively targeting Indigenous fishers. All of this anti-Indigenous rhetoric really was just racist propaganda. Tribal governments and their members were honestly just as concerned, if not more so, about the condition of the fisheries as the states were. Many tribes had fishing regulations for their members, though most of them were so small and impoverished they couldn't afford to hire anybody for enforcement. They relied on the honor system, peer pressure, and traditional values of sustainability to ensure compliance. This, of course, did not please state regulators, who habitually pushed to extend state authority onto the reservations themselves, though the larger tribes like Yakima and Quinault had more robust systems and even fisheries management staff. In fact, in 1964, several tribes got together and petitioned the Washington legislature to commission an impartial study of the fisheries. It would include federal and state agencies and examine all salmon and steelhead fishing in the state to determine best practices for management. The state did not respond. A quote from the book An Uncommon Controversy sums up quite well the state's perspectives in the late 60s. What has changed basically in 70 years is neither the state's view nor the Indian fisheries, but the pressure of people and industry on the fish and the conditions which support the fish. The state has shown varying degrees of tolerance toward the Indian fisheries, from being very lenient to harassment, from disclaiming jurisdiction on reservations to endeavoring to secure agreements to carry out what it sees as conservation needs. But it has never seen the Indian fisheries as part of the total fisheries of the state, except as a threat to commercial and sport fishing. In the state's view, the non-Indian commercial and sport fisheries are the real fisheries. Their protection has been the purpose of the agreements with the tribes. Any recognition of Indian interest has been incidental. Washington was especially aggressive in prioritizing the needs of the non-native fisheries. Beginning in the early 60s and lasting for the next decade, wardens from the Department of Game would regularly stage violent raids on indigenous fishing communities, concentrated mainly during salmon season. As many as 50 wardens and state troopers would descend with billy clubs, tear gas, and riot gear against families with old folks and small kids barely catching enough fish to subsist on and sell for some cash. They would beat up the fishers and make arrests. One fisher described the raids as, quote, ugly, heart-rending brawls. And it's not like these fishing communities were running huge commercial operations. When dozens of police raided Frank's Landing on one occasion in 1962, they found 4 houses and made 5 arrests. Some of these raids were caught on camera and garnered national attention and sympathy for the fishing rights struggle. With decades of pressure and now with a national audience, Northwest Indigenous fishers fought back. The first protest occurred on December 23, 1963. It was a rather small affair where a number of Indigenous fishers, largely from the South Puget Sound area, appeared at the state capitol in Olympia, carrying signs saying, "No salmon, no Santa." The next month, in January 1964, many of these same protesters, Alan and Maisel Bridges, Don and Janet McLeod, Billy Frank Sr. and Jr., and Ramona Bennett, among others, founded the Survival of American Indians Association, SAA, to better organize their defense of treaty rights. They were joined in founding SAA by members of the local chapter of the NAACP, as well as affiliates of the National Indian Youth Council, namely Hank Adams. The NIYC is a national indigenous rights organization founded in 1961, the second oldest Indigenous American advocacy group still in operation today. Having now organized and with the support and funding of a national indigenous rights group, SAA began staging protests. In 1964, 2,000 Indigenous people and supporters gathered on the steps of the Washington Capitol in a nationally televised event. They created 3 documentary films, including the very influential 1971 film As Long as the Rivers Run, and in 1967 commissioned a book about the struggle titled An Uncommon Controversy, one of the sources for this video, written by the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker-affiliated group. They even got the University of Washington to begin offering its first course on Indigenous law in 1969. Their most famous and influential actions, though, were the fish-in protests, inspired by the sit-ins of the Black Civil Rights Movement. Instead of fishing at night, they would fish in broad daylight and intentionally fish out of season with unapproved gear in the hopes of attracting media and police attention. Often, SAA would notify the media when and where a fish-in would be taking place to ensure there was coverage. They would invite and give guided tours of their principal protest site at Frank's Landing to journalists, filmmakers, publishers, anybody who had the ability to publicize their efforts. The protests indeed garnered national attention and attracted sympathetic celebrities to come and lend their support. Indigenous singer Buffy St. Marie, Black comedian Dick Gregory, and perhaps most famously white actor Marlon Brando, among quite a few others. Demonstrating that racism in Washington could extend to more than just Indigenous people, Marlon Brando got arrested, but the state dropped the charges on a technicality and never prosecuted him. Dick Gregory, on the other hand, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 90 days in the Thurston County Jail. He began a hunger strike and was released to the hospital on day 39 of his sentence after his weight had dropped to a meager 135 pounds. To his credit, Marlon Brando was honestly invested in the fishing rights struggle. He didn't just do this as a clout stunt. He actually wanted to serve jail time for his arrest, but the state wouldn't bite. Janet McLeod was selected to be SAA's first leader in 1964. In both her public speaking and writing, she was fiery and militant. She didn't pull any punches and helped set the confrontational tone of the group. Indeed, pretty much all members of SAA, especially the leaders, got arrested at least once. Their approach was not met with approval by many in Indian country. A great many Indigenous people were worried, and in my opinion quite rightfully so given the US's track record, that pissing off white people could only result in further restriction of Indigenous rights, not any expansion of them. Local tribal governments had been trying a conciliatory approach with the state for decades, hoping to eventually come to some sort of mutually agreeable negotiation between them, the state, and the BIA. The tribal councils for Nisqually and Puyallup, the 2 closest tribes to SAA's center of operations, publicly disavowed the group soon after its formation. SAA, for their part, accused tribal governments of being overly influenced by the BIA and of, quote, stooging for the whites against their own people. This was a divide that would be repeated many times over in the Indigenous rights struggles across the continent, demonstrating that opinions amongst Indigenous peoples were never homogeneous. The Fishins were massively successful at garnering national attention, wanted by the protesters, unwanted by the state. Sympathetic supporters came from across the country to lend a hand. The increasing numbers and attention of the protests angered both state authorities and the non-Indigenous sport and commercial fishers. The Sportsmen's Council got so mad that in December of 1964 they demanded the state force the protesters' hand by bleeding the rivers dry of fish. Apparently forgetting that they claimed to be a conservation-minded organization, they called on the state to, quote, open all affected streams and adjacent rivers to all legal sport and commercial fisheries and to allow such waters to become barren until such time as the Congress of the United States or the courts of our land sets up enforceable regulations that will allow the state to carry on a reasonable fisheries. The game authorities used the difference of opinion amongst Indigenous communities to their advantage, crafting a narrative that there were good Indians and bad Indians. The good Indians comprised, literally, 99% of the state's population of 18,000 and were obedient, law-abiding citizens. And the bad Indians were a vastly outnumbered minority of only 178 who were also universally disliked by their own communities and solely responsible for the dismal fish populations throughout the entire state. Man, those 178 Indians really do get around. The Department of Game even suggested that these rogue actors were going to turn their attention next to decimating deer and elk populations on national forest land, for some unknown reason. This propaganda had no effect on the popularity of the protests, so the state resorted to increased violence. The largest and most infamous raids so far occurred on October 13, 1965. 45 game wardens descended on Frank's Landing, beating people with clubs in what one witness described as a, quote, vicious, unwarranted attack that resulted in 19 arrests. Now, SEA was not a pacifist organization. They had already publicly threatened to defend themselves, and the protesters fought back with paddles, sticks, fists, and whatever else they could find. Billy Frank Jr. described the incident as a, quote, knockdown, drag-out fight. At the time, it was mostly women and children who were at the landing, who were not spared the police brutality, but there were some men and non-Indigenous supporters who tried to defend the women and interfere with the arrests. Several witnesses would later allege that at least a few of the officers smelled of alcohol. The whole thing was caught on camera and turned out to be a PR nightmare for the state. In the aftermath, the ACLU volunteered in early 1966 to represent pro bono anybody being prosecuted for fishing protest-related charges. The DOJ too began getting involved, filing amicus curiae briefs in cases. Up until this point, the protests had mainly been concentrated to the activities of SEA in the South Sound. However, 1966 saw an expansion of open resistance to other areas of the state, namely conflicts between Yakima tribal members and authorities of both Washington and Oregon in the Columbia Basin. Janet McLeod stepped down as head of SEA in 1966 to focus more on education of Indigenous culture, and Hank Adams took over. The scale of the protests continued to grow. There had already been outside sympathizers coming to the events, but in 1968, Adams put out a specific call for them. SEA was launching a 5-day straight fish-in at Frank's Landing and, due to the escalation of hostilities, wanted people to help with security against the police. The encampment at the landing swelled to more than 250 demonstrators, and rather than the original 5 days, the fish-in continued for several months. By now, SEA had the vocal support of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, MLK's organization, had been receiving donations from several churches, both publicly and anonymously, and even had the presence of at least one member of the Black Panther Party at the landing, which definitely drew police attention. By the early 70s, the protests were having a favorable result. Public opinion had shifted firmly in favor of the Indigenous demonstrators over the last 6 years. The tribal governments were now on board as well, and the state began to cave under the pressure. In 1970, in a major reversal of policy, the state opened up the Puyallup, Nisqually, Muckleshoot, and Skokomish rivers to 2 weeks of net fishing. This severely pissed off the Sportsmen's Council, who began staging a handful of their own counter-fish-ins in protest of the tribe's special rights. The major turning point in the conflict came in September of 1970. Earlier that year, the Puyallup tribal government had found a small piece of land along the river that still belonged to the tribe. It had been overlooked and never allotted or sold out of tribal ownership. SEA set up a major encampment there with as many as 300 protesters and supporters. Again, demonstrating that they weren't pacifists, Sayed loudly proclaimed that they would defend themselves against police aggression and had set up their own police force of at least 30 guards armed with knives, guns, and a firebomb to patrol and protect the camp. In a demonstration of just how much attitudes had changed over the years, the presence of armed protesters was officially sanctioned by the tribal governments of both Nisqually and Puyallup. On the morning of September 9, 1970, over 300 agents of the Department of Game, backed up by state troopers, descended on the encampment in the largest, most violent, and most widely televised incident of the struggle. Clad in riot gear and spraying tear gas, they made over 60 arrests, but not before several hours' worth of fighting between them and the armed protesters. The encampment was situated near a highway bridge over the river, and several police were atop the bridge, firing down into the protesters. The armed guards shot back, though thankfully nobody was hurt. To get the cops off the bridge, the protesters used the firebomb they had to set it ablaze. Though it was clear both sides used violence, the public largely blamed the state as the aggressor. And if the 65 raid on Frank's Landing was a PR nightmare, this raid on the Puyallup encampment was a hellscape. The state dramatically scaled back its enforcement of off-reservation fishing regulations in the aftermath. For example, the next year in 1971, Nisqually fishers were able to fish the whole salmon season without a single arrest. The most consequential mistake of the state's brutality in the 1970 raid, however, was that U.S. District Attorney Stanley Pitkin was present at the encampment. He witnessed the whole thing, even himself getting hit with tear gas. 9 days later, he filed suit in federal district court against the state of Washington on behalf of Northwest tribes. The U.S. v. Washington case had begun. Before we delve into U.S. v. Washington, there are two more cases that set the stage. As mentioned before, the courts had been quite busy since Tulee, and only got more so after the protests started. Finally, in the late 60s, judges began making broad-scope rulings in an effort to introduce new precedent that would solve the conflict. Again, however, for states hell-bent on not changing their ways, these rulings left loopholes that Oregon, and especially Washington, exploited to their advantage. In Puyallup v. Department of Game in 1968, called Puyallup 1, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Tulee precedent that the state could regulate off-reservation fishing for conservation purposes. It added the additional caveat, though, that the regulations could, quote, not discriminate and had to, quote, meet appropriate standards. The court, however, failed to adequately describe what they meant by these terms, and so very little changed. The next year saw the U.S. v. Oregon case. It's also referred to as So Happy v. Smith because they started as two separate cases which were then consolidated into one. This was the closest ruling so far to offer a potentially viable framework for solution. It was also the first major ruling where multiple tribes were represented, with the Warm Springs, Umatilla, Yakima, and Nez Perce all being party to the case. It was heard by federal district judge Robert Boldt. Recognizing that these states had by now demonstrated a pattern of intransigence and being tired of hearing fishing cases piecemeal, Boldt did make an effort to issue a comprehensive ruling that would be hard to ignore or sidestep. The tribes in this case conceded that Oregon had authority to regulate off-reservation fishing. Unlike other Washington tribes, they weren't alleging that the state had no right. They were alleging, however, that the state was overstepping its authority. Boldt concurred with the tribes. He ruled that the state needed to regulate the fisheries in such a way that tribal fishers were able to harvest a, quote, fair and equitable share of the catch, rather than depriving them as the state had been. He also ruled that in order to do so, the state needed to consider the indigenous fishery as a management priority equal with the priorities of non-indigenous commercial and sport uses. Basically, the state needed to manage the fisheries with the needs of non-indigenous commercial fishers, non-indigenous sport fishers, and indigenous fishers all in mind as a goal. To do any less would be to violate the tribe's treaty rights. Recognizing that this was a matter not likely to be solved easily, Boldt assumed continuing jurisdiction for the issue. Numerous subsequent cases regarding all sorts of tangential issues have been heard as part of U.S. v. Oregon all the way up to the present day, and it is one of the longest-running federal district court cases in history. Despite his best efforts, however, Boldt still couldn't outsmart the wordsmiths at Washington's Department of Game. He did define what he meant by a, quote, fair and equitable share better than previous courts had defined their terms, but still not good enough to leave Washington without an exploitable loophole. Thus, the case still did not change Washington's behavior. Washington had thus made a loophole out of necessary for conservation, does not discriminate, and a fair and equitable share. These guys either really paid attention or really did not pay attention in English class. It was up to the next major case to break this trend. The case was filed on September 9, 1970, in Federal District Court in Tacoma. The decision would not be handed down until February 12, 1974. It was assigned to Judge George Boldt, and when the tribes first heard this, they thought of petitioning for another judge. Boldt was a conservative judge with quite a reputation to match. He'd been nominated for his positions by both Presidents Nixon and Eisenhower, and was locally famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, for being short-tempered with anti-war protesters who appeared in his court. In fact, when she was still head of SEA in 1966, Janet McLeod wrote an article demonstrating the anti-Indigenous bias of local judges. In that piece, she quoted Judge Boldt as having once said, "I don't want to hear any more about these damn Indian fishing cases." However, the tribes soon lost their apprehensions as it became clear that he was going to at least give them a fair shake. 14 tribes eventually signed on as plaintiffs, with all but the Yakima being from western Washington. Many more tribes who did have standing in the case nevertheless refused to sign on as they were worried it wouldn't go their way. Most of the 4 years was spent in research, with the tribes and their lawyers consulting anthropologists, ethnographers, historians, archaeologists, linguists, etc., to establish before the court their deep histories in the region and the critical importance of the fisheries to them, both economically and culturally. In trial, the plaintiffs called dozens of Indigenous witnesses to the stand, many tribal elders. Many of these witnesses included oral histories in their testimony, something the state took umbrage with, but Judge Boldt let stand. As an aside, one of my college professors was a lawyer at the time and was present at many of the hearings. She told us that Judge Boldt, who was in his late 60s, got along quite well with the elder witnesses and tended to let them ramble on at length, much to the chagrin of the state's lawyers. Unlike the Oregon case, the Washington tribes were alleging that the state had no authority to regulate off-reservation Indigenous fishing, and that the treaties entitled them to an equal share of the catch to the non-native fishers. The treaty phrase "in common with" and Bologna's fair and equitable share were major points of discussion. The state's arguments in trial raised major questions about Indigenous identity and who qualified as an Indigenous person. In Winans, the court had ruled that treaty rights were secured in the tribe, not individuals. Thus, an Indigenous person who was an enrolled member of a tribe had access to treaty rights. An unenrolled Indigenous person got no rights. The state thus raised questions of how blood quantum and intermarriage impacted tribal membership. Attempting to make the treaties look like out-of-date relics with no impact on modern Indigenous lives, the state argued that modern Indigenous peoples were so assimilated that they were essentially no longer Indigenous. The state's lawyers made a point of asking each Indigenous witness how they were different from average white Americans, something which many of them honestly struggled to do. The state also intimated that the use of modern gear by Indigenous fishers, instead of sticking to the traditional gear in use when the treaties were signed, further demonstrated the irrelevance of the treaties. 2 previous court cases had ruled that Muckleshoot and Puyallup were no longer federally recognized tribes. Both of these rulings had been overturned, but that didn't stop the state's lawyers from bringing the issue back up again in this case. The state even asserted that the fact that the BIA had been so uninterested in upholding Indigenous fishing rights prior to the 60s served as evidence that those rights no longer existed. Let's take a step back and consider these arguments for a second. United States policy towards Indigenous peoples for much of its history, and certainly the majority of the time between 1880 and 1970, had been focused on eliminating indigeneity as a separate identity. The goal of the US was for Indigenous people to stop existing as Indigenous people in order that they would stop asserting their Indigenous rights over their land. The federal government and white American society as a whole tried many different approaches, many different times to bring this goal to fruition, most of which involved discriminating against non-assimilated natives. And indigenous peoples had many different reactions to all of this. Some staunchly resisted, some fully assimilated, some a mixture of both. But whatever their reaction was, it was always in an attempt to secure the best possible future as they saw it for themselves, their communities, and their descendants. The state of Washington was now arguing that any assimilation by indigenous peoples in reaction to U.S. harassment fully extinguished whatever rights they possessed prior to colonization. For decades, the US and Americans were telling indigenous peoples, assimilate, assimilate, that's your only choice. And indigenous people were discriminated against if they didn't assimilate. Now, in a cruel twist of irony, the state of Washington was saying, if you assimilated, you made the wrong call, you get no rights. It's a sick game. After 4 years of research, argument, and deliberation, the Boldt decision was finally handed down. It would prove to be one of the most consequential vindications of indigenous treaty rights in U.S. law of the whole 20th century, probably in all of U.S. history. The decision was massive, 130 pages long, and had to be bound and published as a book. To put this in perspective, the next longest decision of the fish wars was the 69 U.S. v. Oregon decision at 12 pages. He went into detail on many aspects of the history of the conflict undergirding his decision, and also gave a brief anthropological history of each tribe involved in the case and their own personal histories in the struggle. For some of the plaintiff tribes, this was the first time anything about them had ever been put in print. In a decision that stunned everybody, Boldt sided with the tribes on pretty much every matter in question. He ruled that the state had grossly violated treaty rights on countless occasions, ordered that the tribes were entitled to be co-managers of Washington's fisheries along with the state, and, the part of the decision that pissed off a lot of white people, declared that the tribes were entitled to up to 50% of the state's fish. The only major point where he broke with the tribes was on the question of whether or not states had off-reservation regulatory authority over treaty activity. He upheld Supreme Court precedent on this point, but it's pretty clear he didn't want to. He only did so because he was a lower court judge and couldn't unilaterally overrule the Supreme Court. He spent 7 pages detailing cases that serve as precedent establishing this state authority. For every case, he demonstrated how the Supreme Court had always just assumed a certain modicum of state authority, but had never adequately justified it. He presented a pretty solid case that the Supreme Court's reasoning had been inconsistent, not backed by strong legal argument, and that there really is no legal basis, at least none that has been thoroughly considered, to grant state authority over off-reservation treaty activities. He also leans on the Winans formula for treaty interpretation to say that there's nothing in the text of the treaties that grants state regulatory authority either. There is neither mention nor slightest intimation in the treaties themselves, in any of the treaty negotiation records, or in any other credible evidence that the Indians who represented the tribes in the making of the treaties at the time or any time afterward understood or intended that the fishing rights reserved by the tribes as recorded in the above quoted language would, or ever could, authorize the citizens of the territory or their successors, either individually or through their territorial or state government, to qualify, restrict, or in any way interfere with the full exercise of those rights. All of the evidence is overwhelmingly to the contrary, particularly in the vivid showing in the record that the treaty Indians pleaded for and insisted upon retaining the exercise of those rights as essential to their survival. They were given unqualified assurance of that by Governor Stevens himself, without any suggestion that the Indians' exercise of those rights might someday, without authorization of Congress, be subjected to regulation by non-Indian citizens through their territorial or state government. It's pretty clear that, were it up to Boldt, he would have ruled in the tribes' favor on this question too. What made Boldt different from all the other judges, though, is that he didn't just stop here. he knew he couldn't completely eliminate state off-reservation regulatory authority. So he did the next best thing and systematically closed every loophole the states had ever conceived of to abuse that authority. This is both what made the decision so damn long and what made this decision so much more impactful than all the other ones. He defined everything, multiple times. He defines conservation, necessary, fair and equitable, discriminate, reasonable, you name it. If you can think it, he probably defined it 5 times over. He repeats himself so much, all to make sure there would be no misunderstanding as to what Boldt was requiring of the state. If you haven't already picked up by now, I read this whole damn thing, and I'm mad at the state of Washington purely for how many times they made this man repeat himself. He allowed state regulation of off-reservation fishing to a point, but defined a stringent list of requirements that the state had to meet before regulations could go into effect, including that all regulations had to be approved by either the tribes or the court. He also permits the tribes to develop and enforce, independent of the state, their own regulations that would have effect both on reservation and over their off-reservation fishers. Once the tribes developed these regulations, the state would no longer have the ability to enforce its regulations on tribal fishers. In other words, the state could only regulate off-reservation tribal fishing until the tribes built out the infrastructure to do so themselves. To appease the state's conservation concerns, he developed a list of qualifications that tribes had to meet in order to exercise this regulatory ability. They are competent and responsible leadership, well-organized tribal government, reasonably competent to promulgate and apply tribal off-reservation fishing regulations that, if strictly enforced, will not adversely affect conservation, Indian personnel trained for and competent to provide effective enforcement of all tribal fishing regulations, well-qualified experts in fishery science and management who are either on the tribal staff or whose services are arranged for and readily available to the tribe, an officially approved tribal membership role, provision for tribal membership certification, with individual identification by photograph in a suitable form that shall be carried on the person of each tribal member when approaching, fishing in, or leaving either on or off reservation waters. Once these qualifications are met, the tribe's fishers could fish free of interference by the state's authorities, unless permitted by the tribe, so long as the tribe met the following 3 conditions. Provide for full and complete tribal fishing regulations which, before adoption, have been discussed in their proposed final form with fisheries and game, and include therein any state regulation which has been established to the satisfaction of the tribe, or upon hearing by or under direction of this court, to be reasonable and necessary for conservation. Permit monitoring of off-reservation Indian fishers by fisheries and game to the extent reasonable and necessary for conservation. Provide fish catch reports as to both on and off-reservation treaty right fishing when requested by fisheries and game for the purposes of establishing escapement goals and other reasonable and necessary conservation purposes. It's worth noting that the tribal fishing regulations only have to be discussed with state authorities, whereas the state's regulations, if they impact tribal fishing, have to be approved by the tribes or the court. Also, many of these qualifications had already been met by most of the plaintiff tribes. As previously mentioned, many tribes were already doing what they could to regulate their fisheries. Boldt singled out Quinault and Yakima as being pretty much within rubber stamp distance of getting approved to carry out this authority. The most controversial part of the decision, even today, is undoubtedly the apportioning of the fishery. How did he reason that 50% of the fish is a fair and equitable share for 2.8% of the state's population? This had to do with that much debated "in common with" phrase. Remember, the state's position argued that this meant Indigenous and non-Indigenous people had the same nature of right, and thus it permitted state regulation. Boldt consulted both the minutes of the treaty negotiations and a dictionary from the 1840s, the closest he could find to 1854 through 1856, to ascertain what the writers meant and what the tribes understood. He found that in the language of the time, "in common with" meant sharing equally, and he found no evidence that either the tribes or the white treaty representatives intended this phrase to be used to justify state regulation of this right. Refer to the quote cited a few minutes ago. He found that the treaties established 2 zones: on the reservation, where the tribes had an exclusive right to fish and non-natives were prohibited without permission, and off the reservation where the two had a, quote, shared right of common access. He further found that the treaty established two parties, the signatory tribes and the United States. Thus, a fair and equitable share between two parties by which they would share equally of the resource meant a 50-50 apportionment. The tribes can choose to harvest less than their share and thus allow the non-Indigenous sectors more than 50%, but they have a right to the full 50. In fact, I don't think the tribes have ever harvested their full apportionment. I think they've always given access to the commercial and sports sectors. And for anybody thinking this is unfair for white people today, it was actually more fair for white people in 1855 because they were in the minority in Washington at the time. Just because demographics have changed does not mean the law has changed. Also, Boldt didn't buy any of the state's arguments about Indigenous identity. He actually brought up that if Indigenous fishers are limited to using 1850s gear, then non-Indigenous fishers should be held to the same standard. Rights do not disappear simply because the culture of the right holders changes. Like baloney, Boldt assumed continuing jurisdiction, and this case is also still open and ongoing today. To say that this case stirred the pot, caused an uproar, made some people a little mad, would be nothing short of a criminal understatement. It hit hard. Non-native sport and commercial fishermen all across the state flew into an instant frenzy. They began illegally fishing in protest, breaking existing state regulations in the process. Angry mobs paraded through the streets, burning effigies of Judge Boldt, hanging effigies of him with signs that read, "A dead Boldt is a good Boldt." They sent him countless death threats and a bumper sticker that quickly burst into popularity read, "Can Judge Boldt, not Salmon." They also turned their fury at Indigenous people in racist tirades. Suppliers refused to sell propane, fuel, and other necessities to Indigenous boat captains, assaults on native fishers skyrocketed, and plenty of protest signs had choice things to say about Indigenous people as a whole. The state immediately appealed the decision and refused to abide by it or enforce it. No action was taken against the illegal white fishing. In another move that differentiated Boldt from the rest, when the state refused to enforce the ruling, Boldt did it himself. He called on the National Guard and the Coast Guard to enforce the 50% limit and to protect native fishers from harassment. The Ninth Circuit Court upheld the decision in 1976, only making some minor changes to Boldt's formula for how the 50-50 apportionment would be calculated. And when the state appealed again, the Supreme Court refused to hear it. With Boldt enforcing his own regulations, the state was left in a bind. They either needed to comply with the ruling or have no regulatory say at all and continue to let Boldt rule as fishmaster. Faced with this, they very reluctantly promulgated regulations in 1977 that complied with the decision. Seeing an opportunity to get the Supreme Court to take the case, several sportsman-aligned organizations filed suit to halt the new regulations from going into effect. The case named, succinctly, Washington v. Washington State Commercial Passenger Fishing Vessel Association, arrived before the Ninth Circuit Court in 1978. Making a comparison that had already been noted, and has been noted plenty times since, the Ninth Circuit Court stated the following in its ruling. Quote, "Except for some segregation cases, the District Court has faced the most concerted official and private efforts to frustrate a decree of a federal court witnessed in this century." You should know you're in the wrong when you're being compared to segregationists. This time the Supreme Court took the bait and upheld Boldt's ruling in 1979, ushering in a new era to the landscape of Northwest fisheries. Many non-natives were still very unhappy with the decision, and in 1980, voters in Washington approved a ballot measure asking Congress to abrogate all Indigenous treaties. Congress did not respond. The Boldt decision was quickly used as precedent in other treaty rights cases across the country. Water rights issues in California, more fishing rights issues in the Great Lakes, etc. Judge Bologna quickly applied its provisions to the U.S. v. Oregon case, bringing Oregon under pretty much the same regulatory restrictions and responsibilities as Washington. The tribes from the Boldt case joined together soon after the decision was handed down in 1974 to form the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. The NIFC helps the tribes organize and fulfill their fisheries management responsibilities and coordinate with the state. It was chaired for over 30 years by Billy Frank Jr. from 1981 to his death in 2014. The tribes in the Oregon case followed suit, forming the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission in 1977. In 1975, seeing the success of the decision, 13 of the tribes who'd originally hesitated to join the case now sued to have the provisions applied to them. All but 5 were granted their request: Duwamish, Snoqualmie, Samish, Steilacoom, and Snohomish. They were denied because they were not federally recognized at the time. 2, Snoqualmie and Samish, have since gained or regained federal recognition, though still have not been granted off-reservation fishing rights to this day. The story of this case is very interesting, though in the interest of this time, I'll save it for another day. I'll put up a list on the screen of all the tribes throughout Washington and Oregon with whether or not they have off-reservation fishing rights and for what reasons. I'll do my best to include non-federally recognized tribes as well, but if I miss a tribe, please let me know in the comments. Despite virulent public resistance, the Boldt decision did materially change the behavior of both Washington and Oregon. Northwest Indigenous fishers were now finally able to exercise their rights to fish at their usual and accustomed grounds and stations unmolested. Things were still tense for a while, and there were numerous other issues to be resolved and dozens of appearances in court over the following decades. But over time, the hostilities subsided, and the tribal and state governments, along with the 2 tribal fisheries organizations, settled into more productive cooperative relationships. The states have realized that the tribes are indeed good faith and highly interested partners in conservation and resource management. Pretty much every tribe throughout the region, even very small and under-resourced ones, operate at least one hatchery. It hasn't fixed salmon populations by any means. Most runs are still on the endangered list, and the ever-present stressors of habitat destruction, pollution, and climate change mean that, despite everybody's best efforts, many runs are still in decline. But it is a much more productive environment than the resource management world was in previous decades. Again, it's not all puppies and unicorns. The tribes still have to take the states to court occasionally to get them to uphold their obligations or force a resolution to negotiations that just aren't going anywhere. A good example of this is the culvert decision in 2018. Hundreds of culverts throughout Washington, those things that allow water to pass beneath the roadway, lie on rivers and streams that host salmon runs. The culverts, in their present condition, prohibit salmon from passing through them, thereby restricting salmon habitat and contributing to poor populations. The NIFC and its member tribes had been trying for years to get Washington to clean up and renovate the culverts. It would be quite a hefty expense, so the state was dragging its feet. The tribes lost patience, filed suit in 2001, and the district court ruled in their favor in 2013, ordering the state to renovate all approximately 800 of the offending culverts, a ruling that was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2018. There are many non-natives still today who don't understand the 50-50 apportionment and think it unfair. I wouldn't, however, write off all of these people as simply racist, as education and knowledge of Indigenous affairs and law is still not a widespread thing. It was only in 2019 that Washington added an Indigenous affairs portion to its public school curriculum that was in any way comprehensive and supported by local tribes. Only time will tell what impact better education will have on Indigenous-non-Indigenous relations. There's still so much more that could be told about this story. I didn't mention at all the Lummi reef netters, and then there's the shellfish drama, but those will be stories for another day. I'll leave you off today with a quote from the testimony of a Lummi witness in the U.S. v. Washington hearings. The U.S. has tried to build a glove to fit us into, and we haven't been able to fit because there's a cultural value difference. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I swear I did not mean to make it this long, though I did want it to be comprehensive. I do want to hear your opinions on video length. Are you okay with uber long videos like this, or would you prefer something more manageable? Do let me know. If you like my content and want to help the channel grow, please consider supporting me on Patreon, link in the description. Please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe, tap the bell, all those wonderful things that help me out in the algorithm. Thank you again very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.